I'm Andrew White. I direct the Center for New York City Affairs here at the Milano School. And the center is an applied policy research think tank within the Milano School. It focuses on poverty issues, children and families, public education. We are the home to InsideSchools.org and to Child Welfare Watch and Feet in Two Worlds, among other things. And the Milano School, some of you attend, those of you who don't, we do a lot of work around New York City, sort of field work in the city, learning urban policy in a real applied way, but we also have programs in international affairs and management. And the philosophy of learning in the field and reflecting on the work is integrated throughout all of those programs. So 24 years ago, New York City elected a Democratic Party leader as a mayor. And he came into office in 1990 with strong ties to labor unions and progressive activists. It was a moment when the city's economy was in terrible shape. You all know the story. Those of you who were here, a series of scandals in the Koch third term, a Wall Street meltdown in 1987, the loss of 300,000 jobs, AIDS, crack, 2,500 murders per year, all that great stuff. Dinkins came in with a lot of hope behind him, but in retrospect, he really didn't have much of a chance. He had another Democratic leader in the governor's office, a man named Cuomo, who was a nice guy. He was great with the rhetorical flourish. He knew how to use a knife in the back room. So what's going on 24 years later? There's another guy named Cuomo in Albany. With many of the same characteristics as his father. He's really good with the rhetoric, and he has very disciplined control of the agenda, and he's skillful at behind-the-scenes politics and at working around the press and with the unions and around the unions. Meanwhile, there's a Democratic Party leader with progressive cred and strong ties to labor who recently won the mayoralty, and he's taken office following on a once very popular third-term incumbent, just like David Dinkins did. But happily, the economic and social context is very different this time around. We have a city economy that has actually created twice as many jobs in the last 4 years as it lost in the recession in 2009. And job growth continues. We have a city tax base that's generating literally 60% more revenue than when Mayor Bloomberg took office. In fact, so much of what our newly elected mayor has been called upon to tackle couldn't be more different than 1990. We don't have a weak urban economy, but the city in some ways is so strong that it's drawing in the wealthy and leaving longtime residents behind. And in many ways, the city's economy, it's in great shape, but wages for working people have been completely flat for many years now. And most of the new jobs that have been created are either for professionals in the top income brackets or for service workers in healthcare, social services, education, restaurants, retail, and the like. So there's lots of opportunities for work, but there's not necessarily lots of opportunities for a lot of our neighbors to make a living that can be affordable in New York, that can make life affordable in New York. Enough money to rent an apartment, for example. So Mayor DeBlasio's big challenge is how can the city capture more of that wealth and growth for the benefit of the working class? At least that's how he puts it. And that's where some of the issues have arisen in working with Governor Cuomo in the state legislature. Universal pre-K and after-school programs are certainly about improving the education system, but they're also about cutting costs for working people, people who spend thousands of dollars on childcare every year. The minimum wage hike that they've proposed is all about making work pay at the low end. Expanding the state's earned income tax credit is another strategy that's been discussed that would help make work pay at the low end, and so on. Mayor de Blasio has to worry about housing affordability in a booming residential economy. He has to deal with the fact that tens of thousands of families are in such dire straits that they're in the homeless shelters and entering the shelters with no expectation of help getting out. So in every one of these areas, he needs some help from the state. New York has a very strong mayoral system. De Blasio controls nearly all the levers of policy in the city. You know, he has OMB, he has all of the government agencies, he even has the Department of Education. All of those agencies, they're responsible for budgets of $70 billion a year. And he even drafts the budget, which the city council tinkers with. But in general, what the mayor proposes, he gets as far as the budget's concerned. Nonetheless, there are some very real restrictions on what he can do. That's because New York City, like all American cities, is a creature of the state. It's chartered, it's incorporated by the state. And in New York, that means our mayor and our council can raise property taxes, but they can't raise income taxes, they can't raise sales tax, corporate taxes, hotel taxes, and so on. He can negotiate compensation and work rules with the unions, but he can't negotiate health insurance and he can't negotiate pensions. Those are somebody else's responsibility up in Albany, even though the city pays for those things out of its own budget. So the city and state are locked at the hip. We have a relatively inexperienced mayor who's just beginning to get his feet under him and trying to figure out how to staff up and to deal with a somewhat confrontational press corps. We have a governor who's remarkably suave, at least in the public eye. So what we wanted to do today is talk about where's all this going. I'm very pleased to have 4 great panelists who I'll introduce in just a second. I was also going to have Bill Hammond here from the Daily News. Unfortunately, he wrote over the weekend to say he'd had a encounter with a mountain on his skis and is less mobile than he wanted to be today, so he didn't come down. So that means I'll have to try my best to channel some of his perspective. So why don't we bring up the panelists, all of you. And after we have a conversation up here, we will open it up to questions from you all and pass a mic around. And if any of you are eager to tweet while this is going on, our handle is @CenterNYC. So directly to my left is Liz Krueger. She is state senator from the east side of Manhattan, and she's been there now 12 years.
It's shocking.
Remarkably enough.
Shocking.
Former associate director of the Community Food Resource Center and founding director of the New York City Food Bank. Next to her is Michael Powell, who's a columnist for the New York Times, reporter for many different papers over the years, Newsday, Washington Post, even the Burlington, Vermont Free Press. He lives in Ditmas Park, Brooklyn, and writes the Gotham column for the Times. Next to him is Thomas Kaplan, who is a reporter in the Albany bureau of the New York Times. I tried to separate you guys, this sort of Times cabal, but you switched it up. So no conspiring from the New York Times. Tom Kaplan is a reporter in the Albany bureau of the Times. He's reported on government and politics in New York for the last few years, and he also covered the mayoral election last year as part of the team. And Michael Benjamin, at the end of the table, is a political columnist for the New York Post and for City and State, and he was an assemblyman in District 79 in the Bronx from 2003 to 2010, and also has worked with the Board of Elections, and is wearing his Syracuse pin, I noticed. So, we have a lot of ground to cover. We're going till 10 o'clock. I wanted to start just talking about this mayoralty. And, this is a different kind of mayoralty than we've been used to, at least over the last 12 years, but really over the last, few decades. How does this city hall stand out to you, both in terms of what you think they want to accomplish and how they're going about it so far? Let's start with you, Senator Krueger.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So for the record, I was an early endorser of Bill DeBlasio for mayor because I ideologically believe where he wants to bring the city is closest to, of all the candidates, where I want to help bring the city. He's a new mayor, as Andrew pointed out. You don't shift a city as big as New York in 56 days. Is that how many days he's been the mayor? So I think some people who are rushing to some kind of early judgment call, hello, 20 years of Republican mayors, 56 days. Could we all have a little patience and support what he's trying to do? Now, I think something else that people have so quickly forgotten, we had this mayor for the last 12 years who was famous for many things, and I hope my panelists might agree with me here. One of the things he was most famous for was spending an enormous amount of money on self-promotion. Everything he did was right. Every other idea was wrong. So you had huge press corps in all the city agencies. You had private money reinforcing the messaging. And he was damn good at that. And so now you get a mayor who's 56 days in, who wants to make dramatic changes in the policies of New York City, and it's not all as shiny and new and spiffy and high-tech and huge amounts of money on press messaging as the old mayor. And I think that's something that I hope some of us will start to think about. I suppose we could all urge Bill DeBlasio to spend all the city budget on press for himself, but I don't actually think that's a good public policy decision. And it always irritated me that the old mayor actually did that with such a huge amount of taxpayer dollars, and then of course had endless of his own money to burnish the things that didn't quite shine enough for his liking with the public money. So I'm still a very optimistic person. I go to community events, for example, something about a new school opening in my district, and everyone, the parents, the teachers, the principals, the superintendent, are excited and talking truth to each other. Under the old administration, nobody was even allowed to do that. Everybody got scared. Like you'd have principals whispering to you outside in the dark alley. Like, I can only talk to you in a dark alley outside because no one can know I'm talking to an elected official. And just, that was a radical change in like the ethos for public school education and for the teachers and parents within, I think that happened like week 3 of the administration. And so I take a lot of this as signs of really good things.
Right. Michael Benjamin, how about your take on the new mayoralty?
You actually stole, and that's not stole, actually, a thought I had in a column I wrote about a month ago, calling the new administration the Dinkins Restoration. Because who would have thought that somebody who worked for David Dinkins as a Democrat would eventually, 20 years later, sort of succeed him in that mantle and having the same sort of parallel narrative that's occurring now. They've had their stumbles, as Liz pointed out, their press stumbles. But those are things that you can overcome. I'm optimistic about their success. There are some things as a centrist Democrat I'm concerned about, but we'll see how things play out. I think it's important that he's getting some things on a public agenda. I think it's interesting to see how he and the governor sort of relate and try to move his agenda forward. I think it's interesting that their two former friends, they were, I guess, the mayor worked for the mayor, so you have that dynamic going on, and sort of figuring out how does this new mayor make Albany work for him. I think he's got some abilities to be successful with legislature because he's a mayor that Albany, that Assembly Democrats have been waiting for. I mean, for a long time, for 20 years or 20 years, Democrats in the Assembly were the ones who were the progressives, try to hold back the tide during the years of the Pataki administration and some of the things that then Governor Spitzer wanted to do. So I think he's one they're looking for, but they're also pragmatic. You have to get through the whole thicket of Albany. And there are things that, Shelley, as a speaker, understands. You have to take policy in small bites. You can't bite it off all at once without, and risk being unsuccessful. And plus, others pointed out, you have to work with the governor. And he's pretty much the 800-pound gorilla in the room at most times. So it's going to be pretty interesting to see how it works out. And I think today's discussion will give us an opportunity to talk further about that.
Yeah. Michael and Tom, to what degree is the press engaged in substance or silliness at this point? I mean, there have been this whole series of things around snow on the Upper East Side, Chancellor Farina and the mayor not closing school, Then on Friday, the bit about, I think it was Channel 2, CBS, that followed the mayoral motorcade through a few stop signs and caught it on video, and the mayor didn't talk about it at the press conference. Twitter was afire, partly questioning responsibly, I guess, why didn't the mayor handle this better? But it's just the fact that these issues are the things that have dominated a lot of conversation.
I'm going to totally disagree with that.
Okay, good.
I think that actually, and I very much agree with what Liz says. It's incredibly early, so that anyone in the press or otherwise sort of drawing grand conclusions now needs to be kind of shown to the door. That's absurd. At the same time, look, he grew, he didn't quite grow up in New York, but he's been in New York for 30 years. As he actually himself said, yesterday, he's been around. He understands there's a certain amount of kind of the ACAC, the Barnum and Bailey stuff that is just part of New York. Get over it, accept that's just part of it. I would actually I think if you look, frankly, at his coverage, it's actually been strikingly substantive. The Daily News is in the middle of a 4-part series looking at the PreK. Yep. Vision Zero made the front of both of the tabloids in town, and obviously got also a fair amount of coverage in the New York Times. His back and forth with Albany has gotten an enormous amount of coverage. So there's a part of me that sort of thinks, give me a break. There's a fair amount of substantive coverage. Yes, there's part of the lunatic circus of New York, and you got to figure out how you're going to handle it. Frankly, I think if he had, with all due respect, a better better is an unfair word. I think as his press operation matures in office, and that isn't to say, it's just to say getting used to this. I think that you could have taken, for instance, the Marcia Kramer business with running the stop signs, and you can make that a one-day story. That's a one-day story if you handle it correctly on Friday. He didn't, so he takes a kind of a bad publicity bath for a few days. He handles it yesterday, and now probably it's over, right? So I think to a certain extent, I think it's, and I admit, I guess I wear my defense to this, having once worked for a tabloid in this town, on my sleeve, but I think it's too easy to say, oh, the press never takes us seriously. No, in fact, they've taken him quite seriously, and they've gotten fairly defensive when I think the press has asked perfectly reasonable questions about how you're going to ramp up, say, PreK as fast as you want. He isn't arguing with the notion, but just to note that there's an enormous governance challenge in going, in adding all of those. And I think there's also some reasons to question certainly the governor's very lowball estimate on PreK, but also I think the mayor has lowballed the ultimate cost of PreK. So I think, these are so in a sense, I guess what I'm saying is there's also some substantive questions that are perhaps seen as unhelpful. But again, that's just that's part of our role. We're, annoying and hopefully occasionally illuminating.
And I think the other kind of part of that is, you're talking about a new mayor who did not come into this job with a great amount of management experience, and that was seen as sort of the question mark. And I think he must have expected that snowstorms, for instance, that was going to be something that you're going to face scrutiny just because that was kind of the unknown. And there have been circumstances where, yes, like how you eat your pizza, that probably doesn't reflect on how you're going to run the city. Like that falls in the category of it's a new mayor, there's sort of a novelty here. But other things, like last week, for instance, just sort of you're going to face questions from the press corps, and there are cases where it could have been resolved, it seems, a lot more quickly. Running out of the room and not taking questions, you can probably get away with that when you're a city council member, public advocate, but when you're the mayor, you can't, and it just then builds upon itself.
How much of this is sort of freshman hazing versus going to be just sort of a way of doing business? Bloomberg, how Bloomberg would have handled these questions. How would he have handled these questions?
Well, he got those questions, and he would get pissy and annoyed, and he would do a Bloomberg, and Rudy Giuliani before him would refer
Right.
to them as truly, really jerky questions. But again, the mere fact that we can say how they'd respond also indicates, I think, they got those questions, and some of those questions, by the way, that they viewed as annoying and jerky were quite substantive, and some of them were kind of foolish and silly. So again, I mean, these are the eternal verities of New York.
But you also have to be, I think as mayor, you have to be strong and be responsive. A Democratic consultant friend of mine told me that while Giuliani was wrong in his view all the time, but he was always strong in his reactions. So you knew where he stood, whether he was right or wrong, you knew where he stood. And last Friday, Mayor DeBlasio made a mistake in not responding immediately to what was said. He could basically, yesterday said the same thing he said on Friday. He just reiterated basically what the commissioner said. But he answered it. And so now let's move on to something else. How are we going to handle eventually if we have water main breaks because of the melting snow and it coming refreeze? Those things he needs to talk about and be responsive on.
Right.
You know, it is interesting. It's true that the city seems to like really tough-edged mayors and executives, and even, continues to elect and reelect sort of tough, mean guys. I actually don't think Bill de Blasio is a mean guy, but maybe that's one of the skill sets he needs to learn how to strengthen or let come out, as the case may be, in order to, deal with issues. Because let's face it, I mean, New York City issues never go away. If you're the mayor, you're dealing with 50 issues a day conservatively, right? 20 that the press might be asking you about. You can't possibly get them all right, so you sort of have to figure out how you're going to answer things the best you can, make the right decisions, and move on.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Right. To what degree do you think he can maintain this popularity that he came in with? I mean, he came in with an extraordinarily strong vote. He had very high popularity ratings at the start. Can he maintain? I mean, Bloomberg. Let's not forget Bloomberg just 3 years ago had approval ratings in the 60% in the mid 60s, low 60s, right? Do you think De Blasio can stay there?
I really think it's going to come down to governance. I mean, if you can, and he's going to have. I mean, that is the thing with being mayor. I mean, it's like being in a to use the horrible sporting analogy, a batting cage with fast, one ball after another coming at you very fast, speaking as someone who usually does terribly in batting cages. And, I mean, he's got a major housing plan that he's committed to getting out by May 1st, in which he's going to try to explain how he's going to create more units, create or save more units of affordable housing than any mayor in the history of New York. That is within that period, eight years.
Right.
He's also going to come out with a Sandy plan. He's also got as I say, the formidable challenge of ramping up a PreK initiative really by September. I mean, and those are just three. I mean, I think we could play out about 14 other things. And then there's
Right.
all the things you don't expect to
Right.
deal with. As Michael was saying, a couple of water mains burst, and all of a sudden we're into a whole discussion about, old infrastructure and how you do that, and all of a sudden he's appointing a commission on that. And that isn't to say, or even to suggest in any way that he would be doing anything wrong. It's just to say that New York is an enormously big policy challenge. So you hope to get some new things done, but also at the same time, I mean, he's got the city of 8 million very type A residents.
Right.
And the other thing I think to keep in mind is that sort of the overriding campaign theme, the inequality, I'm going to work on inequality, that's not something that can be measured quickly or that you'll see a substantial change quickly. So that's not something he's really going to be judged on in a matter of months.
Right.
It's going to be the day-to-day stuff. Did you plow the streets? Did you deal with whatever crisis emerges that the press is going to ask you about every day, because there is one or a dozen every day? And I think that if there can be any very early lessons, some of the distractions, what he would view as distractions, have dominated sort of what he's talking about, maybe a little more than is kind of sustainable in the long run. And
Right.
that's ultimately what at least early, you're kind of going to be judged on. It's not going to be some metric of, did you close the income inequality gap in the first 6 months?
It's really interesting if you think about the other mayors going back to Koch. I mean, Koch came in coming out of the fiscal crisis. Dinkins came in the thick of a recession. Giuliani came in with an agenda to reduce crime coming out of a pretty dire period. Bloomberg came in right after 9/11. I mean, this is the first mayor who's actually come in a situation where he can have an agenda like inequality, and yet to measure that is nearly impossible.
But also, when you want to measure, I guess, public reaction, his favorability polling, for most, I think most New Yorkers, whether they're voters or not, it's about how does the mayor's policies affect me day to day. 2 weeks ago with the snowstorm, favorability probably would have been low because of sending kids to school during the storm. But when you're looking at issues like income equality, you're looking at the other issues that the mayor is really focused on, his housing plan, the public's not going to get that right away. They'll favor it because everybody's opposed to income inequality. Everybody wants their rents lower. Everybody wants a larger house, wants more housing, more affordable housing. So on those issues, I think they'll favor him. It's when it becomes an issue where they're affected personally, whether it's the fact he's ending stop and reforming stop and frisk. So that's not going to affect very many minorities who will be upset with him about that. So he will have that going through unless he has policies that really affect the lives of everyday New Yorkers, and that doesn't seem likely at this point to begin to talk about his favorability ratings. He's going to have a much longer, I guess, honeymoon with the public only because he doesn't have crises that he has to deal with. I mean, like you said, there's no 9/11. There's no there's no, recession to deal with. It's how do we grow New York? How do we build New York? My concern, I guess, would be when he starts talking about building affordable housing and the density and the height of these projects. And depending on where you live, you may not want all these shadows in your neighborhood. So seeing how that goes through, I think, will be an issue. And then I guess if the press begins to talk about some of the, I guess, policy contradictions, what appear to be contradictions, where he's actually working and talking to Wall Street, and he's talking to the real estate industry, and he wants to do things to help them, thinking it's going to help those who are less fortunate in New York. I think we begin to look at how he's going to sort of manage that ability to want to govern and then also govern with those other major special interests that make up New York.
Yeah. So Albany, Bloomberg outlasted 3 governors and worked with 4, and he wasn't particularly cozy with any of them, at least as far as I can recall. I mean, what lessons can we take from how Bloomberg worked with Albany that might be applicable now in this new mayoralty?
Well, I think if you look at the history of the relationship between mayors and governors of New York City and New York State, it's sort of structurally designed to be contentious. So some of them have gotten along better or for short periods of time than others. But it's a model, it's like going into a courtroom. You're representing 2 different parties, each of who wants something the other one doesn't want to give them. So, we're all here in New York City, what I proudly describe as, the ghetto of New York City, where a lot of us don't get out of it that often, and we don't realize how different the rest of the state is, forget the rest of the country. And so I go to Albany every week, and you realize, oh, it's really different in a lot of the state. And New York City, has always, in my adult life, been the breadbasket sending money to Albany, and you think that people would actually know that there.
Yeah.
But no, they will actually fight you on that argument when you say that. Like, no, don't be ridiculous. New York City's taking all of our money and draining the state. And you're like,
Sure.
No, actually, I can show you the numbers. No, you're lying. Now, upstate also has all kinds of economic issues for itself, and I understand that. And in fact, the state and the city, I believe, both do better when we can figure out how to work together as one state. But again, you've got a governor, whoever it is, who wants total control of all the decisions. You have a mayor, whoever it is, who mostly wants total control of all the decisions, at least for the 5 boroughs. And they're each set up to sort of pull each other's hair to try to get what they want. So it's not particularly surprising that even in the first 56 days, there seems to be some hair tugging between 2 men who are both Democrats, who do have a historical friendship, and who started off saying, let's work together to get things done. there's also, I don't think it's a shock, they're really big egos in executives. I mean, there's just some correlation between people who run and win executive positions in government not being particularly wallflower-like personalities. So, you know, I sort of see this as, oh, as expected. Now, Mayor Bloomberg, I remember when he first became mayor, he was like, okay, let's work with Albany. Let's see what we can get done. And then pretty quickly it became like, I hate Albany, I hate all of you in Albany, and I'm not going here anymore.
But first he raised taxes on wealthy, on incomes of wealthy people.
Amazingly, he increased taxes with a surcharge on the wealthiest of a greater amount than Bill DeBlasio's calling for.
250,000.
And I don't remember it being revolution at all at the time. It wasn't revolution in Albany. We voted it through. It wasn't revolution in the streets of New York City. I proudly represent a district that probably has more wealthy New Yorkers than any other place in the state of New York. There's one section of Westchester that might be equivalent, but one or two if you want to compete. And I have always supported those kinds of tax increases, and I always explain to my constituents, here's why I did it, here's why I actually think it's good for you in the city of New York, and I wait for responses. And yes, there are some people who call and yell at me or write letters of anger, and I suspect they're probably not my voters anyway.
Right.
But a huge number respond, no, I get it, you're right, or I get it and I don't really care that much because it doesn't have a significant impact on my life. And so I really, when Bill DeBlasio said, I'm going to ask Albany for a supplemental PIT on the wealthiest New Yorkers, I said then, and I still say now, okay, it's not that big a deal. Other mayors have come to Albany and asked for it, gotten it, and each and every time at home, nothing terrible happened. People just paid a supplemental tax rate, and most didn't seem to blink.
Right.
Right? And actually, just if you want to be a little wonky, here at 9 in the morning at the new school, when you look at high-income earners' taxes, federal, state, and city combined, because we've now been living under the continuing Bush-era overly generous tax breaks for the wealthy, even with increase at the city level, even with the slight increase Cuomo allowed to stay in place 2 years ago, your overall tax bill is significantly less than it was when George Bush became president and dropped everybody's taxes. And people like to conveniently forget that because, you know, there's certain truisms. If you ask any room, do you pay too much in taxes? Everybody will raise their hand yes, or
Right.
95% will.
Of course, Obama raised our taxes. Yeah.
But not like George Bush dropped them, not on the high end.
That's for sure.
So you can actually make a rational, you know,
Right.
position to highest income earners going, not only is this not really a big deal, but look at your historical taxes. You're still going to be paying less than you paid 10 years ago in your lives.
So we'll come, yeah, Tom.
But this speaks to kind of the frustration a mayor faces with Albany, which is you're arguing this on the merits,
Oops.
which
Right.
often has nothing to do with the actual outcome that you're going to get from the legislature and from the governor. And that's, I think, if you go back to kind of the Bloomberg years and the lessons that, sort of the hard lessons he had to learn, things that you would normally think would be no big deal, and why would even the state have a say in this, often were wholly dependent on Albany legislators who had their own concerns about their caucus staying in power, their whatever it may be, things that would be totally detached from the actual issue at stake, and yet that would determine the outcome. And I mean, if you look at Bloomberg, who, you know, all-powerful billionaire, could sort of solve any problem through money, for instance, that didn't work with Albany. He would, you know, write these big checks to the Republicans who control the state Senate, and they still wouldn't pass his bills. And it just was one of these things where, like, you may be powerful outside of Albany, but in that world, different factors are at play. And we saw last year, I think, a good example was the mayor wanted speed cameras, I think, right?
Right.
And not, I mean, this was not some grand proposal. I think it ended up being like 25 speed cameras. Now, why to put a speed camera in Brooklyn, you need to persuade an assembly member from Rochester who chairs the transportation committee and doesn't like speed cameras. That's one of those sort of riddles that like would not seemingly make sense on the surface, and yet that's what controls the outcome. And I mean, Mayor DeBlasio will face this too. Sort of the deck is stacked against the mayor. In that power dynamic, the governor is at an advantage, the state is at the advantage. The mayor asks for things, sometimes he gets them, sometimes he doesn't. And that kind of, you can argue it on the merits, and yet, I think you can even argue in this case with the proposed tax increase, it's not really being argued that there's an economic reason not to do it. It's because it doesn't fit into the politics of legislators who are up for re-election, or a governor who is very eager to kind of wear the mantle of tax cutter and also, does not want to upset kind of the Partnership for New York City corporate real estate classes that have served as kind of his political base in some ways. And that's what winds up being what carries the day.
So let's delve into that particular point. Yeah, Michael.
I wanted to also raise, it's the dynamic of Albany, but it's also something called the New York State Constitution.
Yeah, well.
Which is actually the overriding element that exists and allows the legislature and the governor to have control of what happens in New York City. But you also have the fact that, contrary to the myth that Shelley Silver, as leader of the Assembly, controls everything, David Gant, we're talking to the Transportation Committee chairperson in Albany from Rochester, has the ability as a chairperson to hold up legislation. I would tear up my hair when I was supporting the red light cameras when I was in the Assembly and having to talk to David and make him understand why we needed it in New York. His real point of view was that red light cameras are used to squeeze money from the pockets of minority New Yorkers. That's his basic reason for being opposed to them. That's the reason why he's against it. It's not that he's opposed to decreasing pedestrian accidents and deaths. It's because he thinks it has a negative effect on minorities. And no matter what we say as legislators from New York, he has his particular point of view. But eventually you have a compromise with him and you get it through. You pull your hair out and you have to wait until the end of session, but you get something of what you want. And also, I think with the raising the taxes, there isn't a emergency imperative. When Dinkins raised taxes, it was to stop crime, to fund his Safe Streets program. With Mayor Bloomberg, raised taxes coming out of 9/11. We needed to restore the city and get certain things done because we basically had lost some of our tax base because of what happened. So but at this administration, there is no imperative that moves us forward for that to happen, and so allows the Republicans then to remain against taxes, allows our governor to be the tax-cutting governor who wants to run for president and not have to be labeled your tax and spend Democratic liberal from the East. And so those are the imperatives, that the things that are occurring that sort of creates the undercurrents that are there and can make some of us in New York City feel, why is this happening to us? Well, these are the reasons why these things happen.
So one of the theories is that this year the deal will have to be some kind of compromise, and just out of the state budget we'll get some money from UPK, and then maybe after the election there will be some other kind of deal. Is that a reasonable thought, or is Cuomo truly focused on being a tax-cutting candidate for president?
That was always my thought when Blasio, after he won, and sort of figuring out how he was going to move forward on this thing, that when you talk to legislators, as I had done, they believed he would get something this year, but he would really get what he wanted in 2015, because nobody wants to run, and Shelley doesn't want to run his members from those so-called unsafe districts upstate and have them labeled having voted for a tax, or their conference voting for a tax. So Shelley will try to get something for New York, well, less than fully what the mayor wants. And then in 2015, you go for the whole thing, because nobody's running for re-election. The governor may be more willing to work with the mayor to get those sort of things done. And that's what Albany works. Albany is basically about, it's incrementalism. We learn about it when we're in college, and as young people, we wonder, well, why are we doing this? Why can't we just go forward and get it done? No, it really does work this way. And that's what politics is. It's really the art of compromise and being able to get things done in a measured way that still sort of makes it a win-win for everyone.
Right. So Bill Hammond has argued in a recent column that He thinks DeBlasio just wants to raise taxes on the rich in order to raise taxes on the rich, regardless of UPK or whatever else he wants to spend the money on. What do you make of that?
And the governor has said that too.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
Right.
of the mayor.
I don't agree. I think de Blasio has said it. He wants to assure a funding stream that can guarantee moving to full universal pre-K for at least a 5-year period. Now, why does he make that argument that he needs it? Because if you look at the history of Albany and New York City and the commitment to UPK, it's been on the books that we're supposed to have universal UPK, I think since 1997. I'd have to double check the year. Do we have it? No, we don't. We have spotty little programs in various parts of the city or the state because there's no actual funding stream to meet the need. And talk to anyone in a school district anywhere in the country. You don't start up a whole new program because you have a 1-year commitment. You spend 1 year just trying to figure out where you're going to put the classes, hiring the teachers, setting up the program. You don't do all of that with no longer term commitment of funding. And if you look at the history of New York State budgets, frankly, if you're a city in this state, you shouldn't count on us for consistency on anything. I mean, I can show you all the pieces of paper I keep showing that we cut aid, local revenue sharing, something called the AIM program to New York City. We completely zeroed it out because we were in crisis, but each year in the budget we write, but we will give it back to you plus what we took from you this year, next year. And then it was, but we will give you back what we used to give you plus the 2 years we owed you. And then it was just, it disappeared. And a new governor would go, I never made that deal. And we change governors quite frequently in Albany. That's a different discussion. So if you're a local government, being able to count on, I'm sorry, a handshake or a 1-year financial commitment is completely unrealistic. And you would be a fool to base your big picture budget and policy planning on what usually is historically an empty promise. Now, if you have a revenue stream that you control, as somebody was pointing out, and there's very little in budget you get to control without keep going back to Albany, then you maybe can do something. Now, it's also happening at the same time as was said, we have a governor who says he wants to cut all these taxes. We have a governor who says we have a $2 billion surplus, except we don't, and Tom Kaplan has written very articulately about that, so it's okay to make all these tax cuts. So I'm sorry, if I'm like the budget wonk in Mayor de Blasio's administration, I'm going, there isn't a surplus for them to give you this money. You can't count on them for more than 6 months of the year. We have a master list of all these things that New York City isn't getting that it should have been getting anyway. And we really need an ability to guarantee we've got the money for this program, which is important, but isn't worth doing for 1 year. I mean, it's.
I also think the governor is, to some extent, piggybacking off of
Yeah.
that, playing a fairly, you could say, hardball game or cynical game of politics. He doesn't have remotely enough money in his budget to even ramp up New York City's pre-K, much less the entire state. Yet he's very successfully cast this as essentially the rest of the state, against New York. New York, this wealthy city, is going to do this on its own and sort of leave the rest of the state. But it's interesting when you, and last, I guess it was a week or two ago, it was like the Spanish Armada sailing out of a harbor. You would see these, one email after another started arriving. The mayor of Newburgh says unfair, a school board member in Buffalo says unfair, and it's just one after the other. And it was sort of miraculous. They all of a sudden all agreed with the governor. But when you actually call some of them, you find they have actually, in many cases, perfectly good reasons, no intention of ramping up a pre-K. The mayor of Newburgh has, an ongoing disaster, which is Newburgh, to deal with. And I don't mean that in any way I'm just saying, it is a rough, tough city with none of the built-in advantages of New York. They really have no tax base, right? So the last thing she needs is to be ramping up this ambitious pre-K program with, again, and this goes back to Liz's point, the problem that, well, how do I know that the funding's going to be there the year after? She doesn't. So I would, I think what Cuomo is banking on is that strikingly few of the rest cities and towns in the rest of the state are going to ramp up pre-K. To the extent they are, the extent that there are a few that will do so, it will take them a long time, right? And again, this is the management challenge for DeBlasio. He's gambling that it's also going to be harder in New York than it appears, and therefore this piffle amount of money that he's put into the budget will cover him for the year and kind of, takes it beyond the election, his election year, allows him to go as both, I've said I would write a free check and I'm going to cut your taxes and, by the way, vote for me in November.
Right.
By the way, it's not just the towns in Newburgh, it's pretty much the entire rest of the state. Because remember, even though Michael rightly pointed out, we are dependent on Albany for all tax decisions. We have a personal income tax in New York City, and the rest of the state doesn't, except for Yonkers, which is another odd story. And so we don't have this property tax, school tax interconnection, which, thank goodness, actually, it's one of the smart moves New York City did over history. And so the rest of the state is reeling from the 2% tax cap rule, school districts laying off teachers, school districts in total panic about adequate funding from Albany or from their own total tax base. So I hear constantly, just school districts, towns, big cities, upstate going, oh, I guess we could do UPK if we cancel kindergarten.
Right.
But then they come for a year, they go home for a year, they come back. Do we really think that's a good model?
Well,
I'm
this
like,
is
not so much.
Right, and the $100 million in the state's budget proposal might as well be $100 million to the school system that wasn't given last year. I mean, the state percentage of DOE's budget has declined year after year the last few years. So
I mean, the lawyers are back in court on CFE.
Right.
Some of you in this audience, I know you forever. You know what I'm talking about, like 13 years of litigation around campaign for fiscal equity to try to get fair funding for high-need school districts. Really, it was originally New York City, but it sort of expanded to the state. Well, now a bunch of other areas of the state have gone back into court on CFE lawsuits. It's like we only got it right for like 2.5 years.
So thinking about the strategy, not just on UPK, but on the minimum wage and other proposals of the mayor. First of all, Michael mentioned this, Tom has written about this, that the Assembly is DeBlasio's natural ally. They've been waiting to have a Democrat in City Hall for years.
Me too.
And you too. But then there's where does power truly lie in the Senate? Is Jeff Klein vulnerable this year?
Yes, he is. And, anybody who follows Albany follows the sort of craziness of the Senate. In fact, there was a Good Times article today by Jesse McKinley about how many votes does it take to pass a bill in the Senate. And it's actually still constitutionally up for grabs.
Not totally clear.
There are 63 senators, so at least according to
supposedly.
So in theory, you need 32 to pass a bill, but we only really have 61 because 2 left. Eric Adams went and became the Brooklyn Borough president, and this Republican from Long Island, Chuck Fuschilla, jumped out of the prison, jumped the fence midnight on New Year's Eve.
Right.
Literally, he escaped the New York State Senate without telling anyone.
Plus, don't you have a couple who are awaiting indictment? Or?
You have a few waiting indictment. That's just typical normal politics.
It is Albany.
But the question is, do we have 61 elected senators or 63? I personally think the reading of the constitutional sentences, only 61 are elected right now. The other 2 actually resigned their seats. So it doesn't matter if once upon a time they were elected, they have physically resigned their seats and taken other jobs. But people still think it's 32. It's not for me to be the arbiter. So can you get 32 votes for anything controversial this year, where you've got the 4 IDC members who broke off from the Democratic conference to, in theory, move progressive legislation by allowing the conservative Republicans to keep control of the Senate? That logic's never really worked for me, and I certainly haven't seen evidence that it's worked for the people of New York.
Right.
But you have that reality. You have a Democrat from Brooklyn, Simcha Feldher, who ran as a Democrat, and before he figured out the drive to Albany had announced he would join the Republicans. I was like, huh? Like, you have to get here first, then realize you don't like any of us. But
Right.
he skipped that part and just joined the Republicans. So can you get 31 or 32 votes for anything controversial? Very hard to see that story this year, other than hopefully in my partisan argument, more and more New Yorkers will go, okay, A, this really isn't working, and B, if a majority of people are voting for Democrats to be their state senators, how come the Democrats don't get to be the majority in the state Senate?
Strange, isn't it?
So I'm hoping that people do wake up to that. There's a variety of scenarios where things could change before the next election, but my gut is things won't really change until January 2015 after the elections this
Right.
November. So
So-
it's never boring in the Senate.
So on the minimum wage, the legislature is saying they dealt with this last year. It's going up to $9 an hour next year. Tom, you wrote about this, and you mentioned in your article that the Working Families Party and 32BJ are campaigning in support of raising the minimum wage or giving the city the authority to raise the minimum wage. Can an outside strategy with the unions have an impact even this year on UPK and on minimum wage? I mean, it was only a few years ago that $11.99 scared the heck out of a bunch of upstate Republicans when they started running ads against them around Medicaid, healthcare policy and legislation.
It's hard, I think, to see the path to success on a couple of these. The Republicans have been, I mean, the minimum wage in particular is one that they have been pretty adamant. I mean, they were against raising it statewide last year to begin with and kind of opposed that for a very long time before agreeing to kind of a compromise where it was watered down with some things that Democrats now, I think, regret a little bit. So I don't know what buttons could be pushed from a labor standpoint that would frighten them. I think the Jeff Klein dynamic is very interesting because he is concerned about self-preservation for good reason, given that he has kind of a target on his back. And he has tried very hard to make himself as close to the mayor as possible, as sort of the mayor's guy in the Senate majority. But he doesn't seem to be in a position to actually produce results on any of these things because at the end of the day, the Republicans still don't want to do the tax. They don't want to do anything minimum wage related, and they have to agree. So I don't know how far that gets him. But I think it gets back to this point of this year, just because of the Senate dynamic, is very unpredictable and it's hard to see anything major happening given how kind of unstable everything is and how everyone is waiting to see, does the IDC make it to another year? How do they make it to another year? What do the mainline Senate Democrats do? Do they pick up seats? So everything is kind of paused a little bit. And some of these issues, so the minimum wage, I think, is one where, as far as the mayor is concerned, it's a little puzzling what his strategy is because you have kind of a couple issues. So the Assembly Democrats want to raise the minimum wage statewide more than it was raised last year. And I think the Senate Democrats support that as well, I would imagine. There's also an effort to allow local governments to set a higher local minimum wage, which there's outside interest in and the Senate Democrats want to do. but there's not a lot of interest from Jeff Klein, or even I don't think I've seen the Assembly talk much about that. They want to raise it statewide. And so what happens, I mean, the mayor raised this, put it sort of on his priority list, but I don't think anyone can explain how you would win approval of that this year. So,
May I say,
Michael.
I think it's the end game really is the election in 2015. From Labor's perspective, it's about electing a Senate that can advance these agenda items. It's also about something the Republicans have been very good at, creating an agenda, something to push back against Democrats. Democrats in the Working Families Party now have something to push back against Republicans when they run for Senate. They are opposed to the minimum wage, raising it to $10.10. They're opposed to UPK. They're opposed to allowing New York City to have independence, to be able to tax itself at a rate that it desires to tax itself at. So it creates a rationale to run against Republicans and to use it as a club against them. I think that makes sense in that perspective, and given the fact Albany works incrementally, and what you think of as today's agenda is actually tomorrow's, is where they want to be. I think Working Families understands that, and I think that's where they want to go. And I think it's a pretty clever and smart strategy. And I think it will probably be successful. I don't know if Jeff Klein, he may be vulnerable, but I think Jeff is also liked in his district, and a lot of times it's about the fact that your constituents like what you're doing for them. And he may squeak out a victory over whomever runs against him. There's talk of maybe Oliver Coppell, who has, if anybody is a poster child for being in office forever and in different offices, city council, state assembly, former AG, it's Ali Coppell, and in fact, he's also much older than Jeff. And for me, it's interesting because both are Bronx Science graduates like I am. So it'll be great to see this Bronx Science primary and see who wins.
But it's also opposed, I mean, so it's an agenda that pits them against the Republicans. It also, at this point, is pitting themselves against the governor.
But it's also, Michael and I don't often agree on the policy, but it's also a really new idea around the country of allowing minimum wage to be established at a municipal or county level instead of state by state. And so you have to assume that kind of proposal requires a lot of dialogue and analysis before you move a state or the first state in the nation to do this.
Right.
But second, it is a worthy discussion. I agree completely. It's a worthy discussion, and that I don't really think those often are only a one-year exercise. I mean, in November, released my plan to legalize and tax marijuana. Now, did I think that was going to pass in the New York State legislature when I got in there in January? No. Did most of the advocates who support it? No. Did I say the day I did the announcement, this will move medical marijuana this year? Yes, I did. And do I think that's true, by the way? Yes, I do. So things are incremental, as Michael described, but you also have to push the envelope, and sometimes pushing the envelope gets you other things sooner that you hope for. So maybe you're all absolutely right. You're not going to see a local right to increase your minimum wage bill passed in Albany in 2014, but might it force everyone's hand to rethink, really, we got to $9 by 2016? And the president has said everybody to 10.10 now, and our costs are much, our
New
cost
York's
of
much
living
more
is much
expensive.
higher, and how do we justify being so ridiculously slow at just getting to $9 an hour? So I think it might be able to push us to do better, faster on the minimum wage, even if we don't move that specific proposal in any short term.
Right.
Can I add also, this discussion reminds me of a phrase from long ago. Many of you probably remember, 51st state. New York City is, again, with this administration, I think, wants to be the 51st state. And it's not just UPK. It's not just setting a higher minimum wage. It's also municipal ID for immigrants. It's possibility of immigrant voting, undocumented immigrant voting. And it's those things I think the rest of the state may not be comfortable with. And I think the governor made a very strong point about allowing localities to set their own minimum wage. I mean, if you're in Buffalo or Watertown, why wouldn't you set somewhat of a lower minimum wage so you can attract some manufacturing or some businesses? That becomes sort of your call for somebody to locate in your town. So I think the governor has a point when it comes, we should be one state, and we should have one minimum wage, maybe one that should be one that actually reflects, you know, it should be higher because of the cost of living in New York, but then you need to sort of figure out, you know, how do you still maintain businesses in upstate New York that aren't quite state-run? Because basically what runs the economy upstate New York is state universities and state government. There's very little real private enterprise that's there. And the reason why you're able to beat up on Republicans on Medicaid is because so much of their population is reliant on Medicaid. And one thing that in New York we sort of don't get when it comes to upstate New York is that when you live in New York, you're about 20 minutes away by taxi or bus or subway to a major hospital. Upstate New York, you're counties away from a major hospital, and there are huge costs in that. And I would always go to the rural Democrats' discussion to understand Medicaid and hospital care and things that occur across the state, and it really is horrifying. I mean, there are upstate communities that are in far worse shape than the South Bronx or Harlem or Brooklyn. I mean, there are children, I'm told, who have dentures because they didn't get quality dental care.
Right.
I mean, there's something, if you want to talk about income inequality and inequality in New York, go beyond Dutchess County and talk to the folks and see what's happening there. Understand why they fight tooth and nails for some things and then say New York City is sucking away from us. It's because they don't have a real tax base that allows them to do the things they need to do to help their people.
That's a good point.
Just one technical correction. The Working Families proposal is allowing localities to go above the state minimum wage. It would not allow
But not below.
localities to go below.
Right.
Right.
So I want to bring up one more issue, and then we'll take questions. Affordable housing. The Times has a great piece this morning about building on Linden Street in Bushwick, where landlords went in and smashed apart an apartment or a couple of apartments to try and push tenants out. Again, these are rules that are set at the state level around rent regulation. Alongside that, there's this question of trying to come up with a new subsidy, rent subsidy, since there's such a shortage of Section 8, to go back to some kind of state and city collaborative subsidy to help get some folks out of the shelter system. This, again, is going to depend on the state. Sort of what do you have any sort of sense of what we might expect in those areas in the sort of DeBlasio-Cuomo collaboration? Will we see affordable housing as a real agenda item in the months to come?
Well, we know the mayor has said yes, that he has a commitment to an 8-year plan for 200,000 units. Somebody yesterday did an analysis saying that will be a $6 billion cost for the city budget over that, I think, 8-year period. Mm-hmm. So the question is the city going to be able to complete its financial commitment to what it says are its goals? You're right, the state, in my opinion, has sort of flunked all tests on housing now since George Pataki took over as governor. Cuomo's actually put some money in and made some commitments, but not enough. But I definitely have a bias here. And of course, we know from looking at the Bloomberg years, he had a grandiose commitment to affordable housing. And now people are going, well, what was his definition of affordable? Because a lot of that affordable apparently wasn't really affordable to the people who needed the housing. Mm-hmm. But we also saw during the Bloomberg years more loss of affordable old units than increase in new units or preserve units. So the net was a loss,
right,
even if there was a lot of money put into a plan for affordable housing. So hopefully the governor and the mayor will learn some lessons from what didn't work in the last 12 years in New York City. I mean, the federal government's trying to completely leave its responsibilities to housing, which is a much bigger issue and fight for us. I can't do this short and pithy because there's so much in housing. I mean, then today's newspapers were just filled with stories, including the Daily News and the Wall Street Journal, that the RSA has put together a new group they're calling the Big Apple Landlords and are suing the Cuomo administration for actually attempting to implement enforcement of housing laws that have been on the books since the 70s, but frankly, pretty much every governor always told its housing agency, never mind, we don't want to fight with landlords, so let them do what they want and don't enforce and don't do your job. And in credit to Andrew Cuomo and his administration, they actually finally put out housing regulations. It took them 3 years, but still, they put out housing regulations that actually matched the law, and they put in a unit within the housing agency called the Tenant Protection Unit, who actually thinks their job is to enforce the law, and brought 28,000 units that illegally left rent regulation back onto the books, and now they're, according to today's papers, they're being sued to try to, I think the language of the lawsuit is, these regulations aren't legal and nobody should be enforcing them. Well, I don't know. I went to school where if there are regulations that go through a correct process and actually match the language of the legislation that was passed, that is actually legal regulation. And state government not only should enforce, has an obligation to enforce. So you've got this huge pushback, and you've got, I mean, as you described that one story, I sort of think of it as like, ooh, let's do like kamikaze sabotage, building by building, to try to harass tenants out, destroy the units and not put them back, and then everybody will go away and empty the building, and then you'll do anything you damn well please anyway, regardless. So there's nothing short and pithy about this one. I believe it is a fundamental number one. I can never decide when you say what are your top three. I always like they're all. But housing, affordable housing, and preservation is in the top three for this city. And we have to confront it, and it's really complicated and expensive.
And if I could, I'd like to add just one word on the Bloomberg. I mean, in fairness to Bloomberg, you know, there was a critique of Bloomberg that they didn't go with their housing, that their subsidy didn't go deep enough. In fact, I would argue, I mean, there was a lot of affordable housing actually produced and saved. You could argue, well, it didn't go, you know, it was, let's say, a median income, and I'm making this up, but not terribly off, say, $40,000. Well, you know, in the South Bronx, median income is $22,000. But you have to understand, and this is one of the things that DeBlasio is rapidly going to confront, is to, if you want to take that median income down to 20, you can do that. You can absolutely do that. But you got to put in millions and millions and millions of dollars more in subsidy.
Right.
That ain't coming from the feds. It's not coming from the state. So you got to do that. It isn't to say you can't do this, but it is a very complicated and very costly process to start addressing that. You also have, I think, fairly, you know, real concerns about maintaining income mixes in houses. We saw in apartment buildings, if you go back to the 90s and the 80s, that became a problem in many neighborhoods where you would, you know, again, for perfectly good reasons, right? You would try to hit that number. But then the problem is you start to lose a very useful sort of social glue that is an income mix in a building. So I guess all I'm arguing is that, you know, it's easy to say, well, you know, yeah, Bloomberg said it wasn't affordable. No, I'd argue it was a very good affordable housing program. We can have real debates about how much deeper, but let's not kid ourselves about the cost.
Well, there's also, I mean, just the sheer weight of the economy itself and of the population growth in this city. I mean, the theory behind developing more moderate income housing was people would move up if they could and free up other housing for very low income people. But there were so many more people coming into the city, so much more,
But
you know, that's a whole discussion.
But to disagree with Michael a little, it's also how you use your program. So there's an estimate that New York City's budget actually has, with tax credits and deductions, $6 billion annually for housing. Percentage-wise, not that much of it is going to actual affordable housing, even if you want to argue 80% of AMI, 60% of AMI, 125%. 421A program, billions of dollars in tax exemptions, almost none of it actually going for affordable housing. The state finally, again, I'm like extra points, Cuomo, They finally just changed the rules around their 80-20 program. It has been one of my pet peeves forever. The 80-20 program is conceptually so that you can have mixed housing with 20% being affordable on-site with 80% not affordable. I get that. That's a good thing. I like that. Except we were subsidizing all 100 units. So we were subsidizing $1 million units in Manhattan, 80 in a building so that 20 in the building could have some affordability factor in it. Should we be doing a subsidy for $1 million, $3 million apartments?
But that was
No.
a state problem, right?
No, but the state finally got it right, so
Right.
hooray. But yes,
Right.
it took decades to actually figure this one out. And there's a whole lot the city could do differently with its dollars and its programs. And again, Mayor Bloomberg did put money into building affordable housing, but he didn't believe he should have anything to do with impacting private sector decisions. So Stuyvesant Town, Peter Cooper Village
Oh, yeah, that
got
was
sold in
terrible.
a horrendous deal that was guaranteed to fail and harm tenants. I begged that administration to insert themselves in there.
Yeah.
Begged, along with half of every other elected official. And the Bloomberg administration was like, oh no, we don't insert ourselves in private sector real estate deals. I was like, well, it's a city of like 20,000 people in those buildings.
And this
You
will
can't
be
say-
the big, I think one of the biggest tests of the DeBlasio administration is if they can harness development in a way that creates more affordable housing. I
But he
want to
may
make sure we get,
But he may find an ally in Governor Cuomo.
yeah.
And I also want to point out that the chairperson of the Housing Commission or Housing Agency is a former Assemblyman, Darrell Towns.
Yep. All right, I want, questions, raise your hand and somebody will come around with the mic. Casa?
Hi, my name is Peter Goodman. In the world of House of Card politics, is the governor the lord of the manor and DeBlasio the vassal? And everything that we're seeing over the next few months is the governor simply asserting himself and making it very clear that no matter the issue, if the mayor is not in line with the governor's policies, the mayor is going to get punished. That the issue doesn't really matter. All that matters is it's very clear that the governor takes the lead.
So I think from a structural standpoint, the governor does take the lead, and I think part of what we've seen, I mean, put Governor Cuomo's sort of political strategy aside, is the fact that he is the one who is powerful in the situation. The mayor wants something, the governor, he needs the governor's support. In talking to the governor about this, he, I mean, first of all, says truly Bill de Blasio is a friend of his and he wants him to succeed, and that they will be able to find areas where they can work together. Having said that, I think with some of these issues, PreK and the tax being the most obvious one, they are clearly going head to head. And one thing you can say about Governor Cuomo is if he's going to get into a political fight with someone, he's going to try to win that fight. And I mean, for instance, the parade of upstate mayors denouncing the de Blasio plan as unfair to poor school children upstate, not saying that was Governor Cuomo's idea, but
But it was.
it was an interesting coincidence.
Yeah.
And things like that. I mean, clearly he is playing to win in this fight. And both of these men are political tacticians, I think, deep down. And we are witnessing that.
Yeah.
Hi. I am going to be part of a statewide lobbying blitz to Albany next week concerning a statewide DREAM Act, since we're talking about education. And I also live in East Hampton, where one thinks of not being an issue. 25% of our students are now Latino. So I wonder what the prospects are in Albany for passage of a DREAM Act.
Well, the Assembly has, if not already passed it this year, definitely would. The governor just recently sort of changed his position and said if you give me a bill, I will sign it. I don't think he had said that up
think that
until
was the
very
first time,
recently,
yeah.
which then leaves it to the Senate. The Senate Democrats will support that bill. It can't come to the floor unless Dean Skelos and Jeff Klein agree it's going to come to the floor, and they have this sort of odd arrangement they've set up where supposedly either one has the right to veto a bill coming to the floor. I always read that as, oh, so if I really want something, I'm just going to hold my breath and not approve any other bill coming to the floor until I get that. So Dean Skelos has been very clear he does not want the DREAM Act to pass. So it seems to me the IDC has to hold their breath until they turn blue, which they are capable of doing, to get that bill and other important progressive bills to the floor. Then you have the question of that 32 vote issue, and I don't know. Now, I also think the governor could do this through executive order, but I don't think that he is exploring that option. I mean, all DREAM Act is, by the way, is TAP money can be used by students whose parents don't have legal status or who don't have legal status and were most likely brought into this country when they were small children, right, statistically. So other states have accomplished this. Again, Sodom and Gomorrah, the salt pillars didn't destroy anyone. Students are going to college. They're getting the education they need to become, employed participants in our society. It seems to me to be a win-win. And by the way, DiNapoli has done analysis that I think estimates the cost at $20 million. It's a drop in the state budget. It's a drop in even the TAP funding. I don't know. So it's embarrassing that I can't say to you, yes, of course the Senate will pass this year, but I'm not holding my breath.
And also, if it's reliant on TAP funding, too, I don't think the IDC is going to hold their breath and force a late budget as a consequence. So I think that may be going against what they would like to do. We also have a state Senate that's opposed to even college courses for persons who are in prison, in just 10 prisons. And so I could see them tying both together to rally their electorate against illegal immigrants or undocumented people and against ex-convicts or persons who are felons. So I think that becomes an issue. But personally, I think the governor is being kind of cynical because I think he believes that Republicans aren't going to pass it in the Senate. So he's throwing another sop, or as I view it, cotton candy to his base to say, look, I'm in favor, but those guys over there, they wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to whether you think that DeBlasio is going to wind up as another Dave Dinkins, a man whose heart was in the right place but couldn't get anything done. So as we look at these, I think Liz said it, DeBlasio has 100 priorities. They can't all be number one. He has limited power to get things done. And Cuomo has his own agenda. They're all Democrats, but he has his own agenda. So what I'm curious for you, this panel, is what should de Blasio's number one priority be? Of all the 47 things he wants to do to have a second term, what is the thing he has to make happen?
I don't know if that's only addressing me.
No, all of you.
Okay. I think the analogy is de Blasio and other Dinkins isn't even the right question. And by the way, I think history showed that Dinkins accomplished a great deal as mayor, even if he only had his one term. So I actually object to the statements that, you don't want to have another Dinkins. But I do think that for de Blasio, he stated it's inequality, which translates in real terms to lots of things. So he's clearly made a commitment to more equal and fair education, UPK through college, and I think mayors do get tested about how they did on education, all right? And if you ever go retail politics in any community in this city, trust me, it's all about education, especially when you're talking to parents and young people and college-age people. I believe a commitment to affordable housing is crucial to the future of our city. I don't know how it plays as a voting scorecard. I see it maybe as a different set of questions. And I don't think you get away being a successful mayor of New York City unless you are seen as making the right decisions on public safety, because it's just a fundamental urban issue. You know, the good news is we have a low crime rate based on the history of New York City, and we have a really low crime rate based on other urban areas of this country. You know, some people said you end stop and frisk, or you change stop and frisk and it all falls apart. I think a lot of us were like, oh, give me a break. But I do think that any mayor getting a second term needs to make sure that his stats, or her stats if we ever have a her, don't skyrocket around public safety issues.
Or
I
just
guess
plain
I would
govern.
say there.
Govern for the people of the city of New York. No, I don't think anyone will vote against, will seek to defeat DeBlasio in 4 years based on his not fulfilling some of his campaign promises. As long as he's cleaning the streets, keeping the schools functioning, children are graduating from high school in greater numbers, I think there's no reason for anybody to be opposed to him in that sense. You govern the city, you keep crime low, you get reelected. So that will be the test of him as a Democrat, is doing those things and hopefully being able to, to spur the economy and grow it through whatever policies he chooses to implement as a way of increasing the workforce and then raising tax revenue. Because once you can increase the labor force, people who are working, whether it's they're earning more because of a higher minimum wage or they're earning more because business is actually locating here and hiring people, then I think that shows you can govern New York City.
Yeah, I think there's very rarely one thing you can point to. I mean, I think that perhaps the one exception that comes to mind is Rudy, right? Giuliani, who ran on kind of crime, and crime went down. We can debate all kinds of things, but the fact is it did, so he threw down on the right issue at the right time, and then we can have a nice rip-roaring debate. But I think generally speaking, you have all of these many things, as the panelists have said. And I also would add that whereas I think Dinkins, and I do think that this is important for a mayor, did not give a sense of sort of having a strong kind of core leadership. And I think that hurt him, both perceptually and sometimes in reality. And if you look at a lot of, sort of Koch, Bloomberg, Rudy, I mean, you had this real sense that whatever, that center was very strong. And I think that early on, DeBlasio's given, has given signs of kind of inculcating that, that lesson from his time with Dinkins. But in fact, look, under Dinkins, quite a few very impressive things happened. Arguably the best stadium deal in the history of the city was made under him, and I know it's controversial, but nonetheless was. Housing, despite a horrible recession, they continued the Koch and continued and strengthened the Koch affordable housing program. The rebuilding of central and northern Harlem is really a testament to that.
And the South
right?
Bronx.
And the South Bronx. They did, Beacon schools. I mean, you kind of go on, and frankly, they laid the basis for 5,000 new cops coming in. So, I think you could argue that history, at the very least, I think is a little bit kinder, perhaps might be kinder to Dinkins in the long run. But I do think, to go back and to finish, I think that ability to show that I'm in control, that is DeBlasio, and that, and that what happens as a result of decisions that we're making, and I'm not going to allow myself to get too distracted, I think is going to be very important for him.
Right. Tom, final thoughts?
I mean, I think we focused to some extent today on his Albany agenda, and I don't think mayors are judged when they go for re-election based on their wins and losses in Albany. I think that's an insider issue. So, I mean, we'll know how PreK works out, because when he's running for re-election, either it's going to be ramped up or it's not.
Right.
And that may happen through money, not a tax. And if PreK is there, it's hard to see how that would be a knock against him if he got it another way,
Right.
not through his original campaign proposal.
Right. Yeah, I do think mayors are pretty much judged at re-election time on, is the economy strong? Have you contained crises and kept things safe? And can you mobilize your base voters? Dinkins wasn't in a position to do that in '93, but barring some disaster, I expect DeBlasio has a good shot at it. So I thank you all very much for coming. I really want, let's have a round of applause for the panel. Our next event is on the evening of March 5th. Please check out your emails. It's about campaign strategy, and it should be an excellent panel. See you then.